richer, poor getting poorer. And global populations are suffering, and they are having a very low level of their day-to-day suffering, and rich are getting richer. Secondly, inequality leads to instability, which leads to civic unrest, riots, even including conflicts, etc. On top of that, we recently have European Union allocating 1 billion euros to the war in Ukraine. UK and France are sending Storm Shadow cruise missiles, along with USA and NATO rearming Ukraine to the hilt. So in this atmosphere, it's a very chaotic, and the atmosphere is such that there is a specter looming in Europe of a nuclear warfare. And we are, dear friends, running into or sleepwalking into World War III. So what I am trying to say is, while the scenario is very bad, we in the peace movement should be, how can we be more effective? Make so much noise, and how can we make a difference so that we can be more effective as a peace movement and build a more peaceful and prosperous world. With these short remarks, I will hand over to Rita Payne, who is the chair for today. She is Vice President of Uniting for Peace. She's former BBC editor of Asia TV and former president of Commonwealth Journalists Association. Please welcome Rita Payne. Rita, the floor is yours.
Hello to all, and I think collectively Uniting for Peace deserves an award for continuing to be promoting and campaigning for resolving the world's problems through talks. Now, I think, as you said, this is probably one of the most disturbing eras for the world. Just to put it in context, in April 2023, Action on Armed Violence recorded 2,632 deaths and injuries from 447 incidents of explosive violence around the world, as reported in English language media. Civilians accounted for 64% of the deaths and injuries recorded. When explosive weapons were used in populated areas, 79%, that is 1,552 of the casualties were civilians, compared to 20%, 132 in other areas. At least one death or injury from the use of explosive weapons was recorded in 24 countries and territories in April 2023. The 5 most affected countries and territories in terms of civilian casualties from the use of explosive weapons were Ukraine, 586 civilian casualties, Myanmar, 309, Somalia, 234, Sudan, 210, and Syria, 82 casualties. So what we have now, this is the context, and this is the framework for our discussion today. So in this turbulent world, how can people, like all the members, the Uniting for Peace and others, how can we bring about a transformation and change? And Vijay has set out, and I won't go through it again, what he thinks is actually inequality is at the root of a lot of all these issues, and of course the arms industry. So I won't hold forth any longer, but Vijay has gathered some illustrious speakers who have a lot of experience, and hopefully they will enlighten us about what they think might be a way to work through heat and turmoil and create and bring about some sanity. So thank you again, Vijay, for bringing us all together. And may I now introduce the speakers, and then I will invite each of them personally to make a contribution. So the speakers today, just to remind you again, is Federico Mayor Zaragoza, former Director General of UNESCO, founder, Fundación Cultura de Paz, and author, The World Ahead, Our Future in the Making. Then we have Kate Hudson, General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, author CND Now More Than Ever, The Story of a Peace Movement. Vijay Mehta, of course, as you know, Chair Uniting for Peace, Board Member Global Alliance for Ministries and Infrastructure for Peace, author of How Not to Go to War. David Swanson, Executive Director, World Beyond War, Advisory Board Member, Nobel Peace Prize Watch, author, War is a Lie. John Biggs, former Guardian journalist who specialized in Asia and East Asia, author, The Glorious Art of Peace. David Adams, former UNESCO Director of the Unit for the International Year for the Culture of Peace, coordinator, the Culture of Peace Network. So these, we are privileged to share a platform with these impressive speakers. So now I will invite each speaker in the order in which their names were announced to give their thoughts. So first of all, may I invite Federico Mayor Zaragoza. Thank you for joining us.
Many thanks, Madam the Chair. I am delighted to participate in this program. And I congratulate also Vijay Mehta, because I think that we are in a moment now in which we must realize that the possibility of having influence for peace negotiation depends on multilateralism and on democratic multilateralism. From the origin of time, it has been always a male absolute power during centuries. And now, for the first time in history, from 25 to 30 years ago, now we are becoming progressively equal. Inequality in our human dignity is disappearing. We are recognizing that there is no discrimination because of gender, because of belief, because of ideology, because of ethnia. No, now all human beings equal in dignity. At this moment, we can start thinking that perhaps, yes, perhaps democratic multilateralism now can come in action, because we are equal in dignity, but at the same time, we can speak. We can express ourselves because of the digital technology. And therefore, we have the most important aspect in order to solve the problems is multilateral democratic system, is based in equality, and is based, that is very important, in mediation, in negotiation, in speaking. Until now, we were unable to do this. When the Charter of the United Nations says that we the peoples, we have resolved to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war, at this moment, we must realize that this was not true, because the people did not exist. 90% of humanity was being born, living and dying in some square kilometers. And they were unable to participate and they were unable to express themselves. Now we can. For the first time, now we can. And we must. Now we must realize that the United Nations was a fantastic design of multilateralism, because Roosevelt not only had this group for realizing this very, very good design, but also his wife, and to appoint one woman at this moment was very rare. Then his wife was the chair of the Commission for the Human Rights. And at this moment, all appear to be, now, yes, we will mediate. We will be able to solve the problems through the force of the reason and not with the reason of the force. But this was immediately disappeared. Why? Because there were 5 vetoes in the United Nations the same day of the creation of the United Nations in California, in San Francisco. In 1945, the same day, the capacity of the United Nations disappeared because of the veto. But when the G7 and the G6 started to be effective, because reasons that now I am not going to give details, but in the October 1986 was a moment of very great hope, because the new president of the USSR was talking with President Reagan in Reykjavik. And he said, now the USSR is going to disappear and a Commonwealth of independent states will be created. Now the reunification of Germany will take place because the wall of Berlin will disappear. But now I am coming here, Mr. President, because we must finish with the nuclear war, because this was terrible. And this is terrible today. We can destroy the planet as a whole. We can kill all the persons, including the next generation. What is this? Why we are in this position? Because we have nuclear armament. And what was asking Gorbachev to Reagan was the complete elimination of nuclear armament. At this moment, United States had 17,000 bombs and the weapons, and the USSR 17,000 as well. And at the end of the day, they arrived to have only 6 and 6. And at this moment, Mr. Reagan said, now, because of reasons of global security, I cannot go further. And it was clear. It was clear that
I have it here.
I can go on. I can go on.
Yeah,
At the end of this,
2-3 minutes
at the end
more.
of
2-3 minutes more.
Well,
carry on,
Federico. Carry on. Keep going.
Yes. At this moment, at the end of the day, they had from 17 to 6, there was a reduction in the nuclear power, but the danger was there. And then was when Mr. Gorbachev asked the President Reagan to consult with the high military group in the Pentagon. And the next day he said, no, because of reasons of global security, I must have this amount of money, this amount of bombs. I am telling this because it was a moment of very big hope. But what happened? What happened is that what Eisenhower has already said in 1961 is that the real power in the United States was, he said, the bioindustrial the Bellic Industrial Group, the group
military industrial complex.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, and then therefore, what I would like to tell is that now we were with the G7 is a supremacist, plutocratic group that is now the governance in the world, and is intolerable this. But we had we said, well, we had the European Union. In the European Union, we can talk about democratic aspects. We can go further in and what has happened. What has happened that now, what is the partner? What is the person that must have relations with Putin in the war of Ukraine? Is not the European Union. As you know, is a military group that is the NATO, is North Atlantic. North Atlantic is now is everywhere, but is North Atlantic military group, and this is the problem. The problem is that G7 represents the European Union, and that is a military group that is leading and is in contact with Russia. We must, and this is my concrete proposal, now we can intervene. Now we can express ourselves. Now movements like this one, like yours, now we can say, no, we the peoples, now we the peoples have voice. Now we the peoples can participate. Now we the peoples can say that enough is enough. And we must ask very rapidly as a collective popular movement to say that the world now in which there is no more differences, there is no more discrimination, we are all equal in dignity, and we have voice and we can express ourselves. Now we must say, we the peoples, we have resolved to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of the war. And now we can participate. And now we can ask rapidly the United Nations to take out the veto of the 5 winners of the one war that ended 75 years ago. And we can ask immediately the European Union to take out this stupid thing of the la majorité. It is necessary, as you know, the unanimity now in the European Union. It has been introduced in the European Union, to take decisions must have unanimity. And the unanimity is the antithesis of democracy. Therefore, my dear friends, the solution for mediation to have the possibility of, instead of saying, si vis pacem para bellum, if you wish peace, prepare war, now we can say, si vis pacem para verbum, no bellum, verbum. Now we can, and we must mediate, and we must have the power of having these institutions as the European Union that take decisions in a democratic way and not in this position of the antithesis of democracy that is the unanimity. And I hope that in this way we can perhaps change and redress the present trends. Otherwise, the present trends are plutocratic. You know what said recently here in Spain, the Secretary General of United Nations? 25 persons have more money than the half of humanity, the 50% of humanity today. Is intolerable. Therefore, we must know that we are all equal and that we have the possibility of express ourselves freely, to say that now, at least in Europe, in the European Union, we will be a multilateral democratic force.
Thank you very much indeed. You have given us so many points to follow up. It's interesting that although we're in a dire situation, you have also injected notes of optimism, which is encouraging, that we can build on, and putting faith in multilateral organization once again. So I think, and we can obviously come back to these points later on in the discussion, but thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Cade Hudson, General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. And of course, as you heard before, CND now more than ever, the story of a peace movement. So Cade, would you like to give us your points and your perspective on the situation today and the way forward? Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Chair. And can I just apologise in advance that I'm going to be leaving after my contribution because I've got another engagement. So I'm very
Understood.
Sorry to miss the discussion. So I'd like to say a little bit about the role of increasing militarisation in the worsening conditions that are facing the global majority. And I'm going to focus a bit on Britain and how its policies have developed in recent years and something of the impact of that. I think we'd all agree that we're living at a time of serious economic crisis. It's affecting millions of people across Britain, not to mention globally. I mean, in many places, of course, the situation is far worse than it is here. In this context, the question of military spending is a controversial one. We know that the UK is one of the world's largest military spenders, and I think that we can say that the UK spends approximately £50 billion a year from the public purse on the military. And in terms of how much that is affecting each of us, I think the 2021 figure was round about £1,500 per household, and I think it's gone up significantly since then. So it's a very shocking amount. And in this framework, it's not surprising that the question of spending on nuclear weapons as well is controversial, particularly when it's posed against spending, for example, on the National Health Service, and it is indeed hotly debated. You may remember 2 years ago when Boris Johnson published his integrated review, he announced a 40% increase potentially in the nuclear arsenal. This was additional to the over £205 billion, which is already being spent on replacing Trident. So the money, nuclear weapons money, was stacking up there. That was announced at the same time pretty much as he said that nurses could only have a 1% pay increase. So there was this disparity, 40% increase in the nuclear arsenal when nurses can only have a 1% pay increase. So this was deeply shocking to many, particularly as it came in the context of the pandemic. And of course, when we were all out there supporting the nurses and so on, it seemed very, very bad treatment indeed. And I think it was perhaps one of the most stark examples which encapsulated the way UK military spending policy has been going in the last few years and how it's been going against the interests very much of ordinary people. So looking at that in the wider trends, we can say that UK military spending rose significantly during the first decade of this new millennium. That was due to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It then dropped from 2009 to 2015 due to the cuts. I'm sure you remember the financial crisis of 2008 to 9 and Tory Liberal coalition and so on, and the austerity which was introduced at that time. Military spending has since increased since 2015. This is people usually ascribe this to situation in Ukraine, for example, and all that sort of thing. But in actual fact, that increase and so increase in militarization has been taking place for the last few years. It really does predate the Ukraine war. And I think we can say that there's been a sea change, particularly under the leadership of Boris Johnson and subsequent Conservative prime ministers. So a strong orientation towards increasing militarization. And of course, with the climate crisis, of course, many people have pointed out, well, actually, if you really want to talk about security and what is going to benefit us and benefit communities globally, you should be addressing the real security threat, that is the climate catastrophe, not this kind of spending on nuclear weapons and spending on war, which actually adds to that climate catastrophe. So I think when I first noticed this, very obvious increase in militarization, that was in late 2020, and Boris Johnson committed to significant new spending on the UK's armed forces. And interestingly, it was mostly on new high-tech technologies. And of course, we've been hearing a lot about this recently, but this was including on artificial intelligence. There's been a lot about AI recently, but this was already big money going on this from the government in 2020. Drones also, of course, cyber warfare, and he allocated £24 billion on top of the existing spending. So this money was already ramping up. And as a contrast, you can say that this announcement was made at the same time as he made that very controversial £4 billion cut in the overseas aid budget. So this kind of lots more on weapons and warfare and so on, a decreasing contribution in the overseas aid budget. And that really couldn't make the government's priorities more clear. And then since then, Chair, I think we can see that this orientation has really been compounded, and it was expanded in considerable detail in that integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy. All that was rolled into one, but instead of having a really strong emphasis on development, for example, the tenor of the document was very much about as Boris Johnson said at the time, global Britain on the offensive, projecting force globally. So the kind of that militarization, that force orientation, rather than the culture of peace, which we would like to see Britain kind of put forward as, global Britain as a global Britain for peace. It was obviously a global Britain for war. And in fact, it was summarized at the time as an attack document. Those of you who follow these things will recall that at the time, the key strategic shift in that document lay in its focus on the Indo-Pacific region, described as a tilt, so orientation not only towards the Indian Ocean, towards India and Australia and so on, building up actually a network of regional allies against China, very much mirroring the US approach. You may remember the Quad, for example. And this made a very clear break with the UK's Strategic Defence and Security Review only in 2015. You may remember from that time that SDSR Cameron, it really promoted closer relationships with the Asia Pacific, including both China and India. Described as the most acute threat, China was clearly the main strategic focus. So you can see how there has been that shift. The review also included the combat plane.
I'm sorry, you're getting drowned out by noise. Could people please mute, please, and let Kate speak clearly? Could you please mute? We're getting interference. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Kate. As we said, there is a lot of interference. So can I reinforce, please, the request for everyone to be on mute, please?
Okay,
so
I'll
Kate, since we're already We've got about a minute left in
I'll just conclude.
your slot. So would you like to conclude? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It's like uphill struggle on the noise.
It is indeed.
Front.
You're being very patient.
You can.
Anyway, so really, Chair, we've seen the worst thing is, which really shows this contradiction, is the most recent budget, the spring budget, where we were all hoping for investment in the national spending, better wages for the public sector and so on. And what we actually had was the government announcing an extra £5 billion of military, 3 of which are going on what they call the defence nuclear enterprise. So this is what's happening. And so to conclude, Chair, I would just say that our government has completely the wrong priorities. Global problems can't be solved by war or nuclear weapons. It's already the world's 4th largest military spender. And as our members say, why should our schools, healthcare services be sacrificed for more military spending? And you couldn't ask a better question. And of course, that is something we will all continue to campaign upon. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I wish you a very positive discussions at the rest of the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. I'm sorry you've had all these challenges to face. I think, Vijay, I think it's the host is in a position to mute those who are not speaking, if that is possible to do. Now, various points have been raised, and I think what, Kate, you've done is highlight the huge increase in military spending, especially by Britain, when there's so many other causes, contrasting that with nurses who can't, we can't afford to give them enough money to achieve a sort of basic level standard of living. At the same time, I guess, being the devil's advocate, we can come to that later, but maybe a point that a lot of people are saying at the moment that actually with what happened in Ukraine, if no one had done anything, what would the peace campaign have advocated? On February the 23rd, 24th, it was chilling when we all woke up to know that the Russian forces actually crossed the border and were heading towards Kyiv. So the question is, when it becomes crucial like that, critical for survival, then what can be done? Vijay, is this something that you would like to address along with your other remarks? Thank you, Vijay.
You would like me to start?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Before I do it, Chair, you are the co-host. Bernie Holland, you are the co-host. And David Swanson, you are the co-host. So any of you can mute people if you like. And
thank you, Vijay.
Okay, and now I'm going to start my presentation. Dear friends, the biggest challenge of the 21st century we face today are disparity of income, wealth inequality, increasing militarism, and continuing wars, deteriorating climate change, cost of living, and energy crisis, to say a few. Another big problem, as speakers before have said, is high militarization, with USA spending $873 billion, and so is Germany, France, China, Russia, and even India, 80 billion. And at the same time, US NATO war against Russia in Ukraine continues unabated, and US is preparing at breakneck speed for war with China, using Taiwan as the excuse. Taiwan, dear friends, like Ukraine, is a pawn surrounding China with military bases, nuclear weapons, and military vessels was highly dangerous and leading to instability. I would say sleepwalking into World War III. So how do we, in these circumstances, how do we tackle global poverty, inequality, instability, and the needs of the bottom billions of society who apparently live below the poverty line without respect, dignity, or value to their lives? I'm just going to highlight some of the causes, dear friends, of inequality and poverty. Because inequality leads to stability in the world in several ways. It leads to protests, civil unrest, and even violent uprising. Additionally, when there is a significant wealth gap, it creates power imbalances which undermine democracy and rule of law. Dear friends, poverty is man-made. UK, for example, is the 6th richest country in the world, and there are more than 2,000 food banks feeding the poor who cannot meet their food and energy bills and forced to take the assistance of food banks to stave off their hunger. Both the UK parties, Tories and Labour, are warmongering parties. Dear friends, military drains resources from social and infrastructure programs. So to reduce the inequality, we have to reduce the evil of militarization, arms trade, military spending, which is one of the causes of poverty. The aim of any government or society is to promote peace, human society, and redouble its efforts to reduce inequality. So what are the mechanisms we can take forward? First of all, global institutions, United Nations, UNESCO, IMF, World Bank, should adopt pro-poor policies because the people in the poor countries need hard cash, much needed currency to sell their goods. So we should have fair trade and lesser import duties. UK government should restore the 0.7% aid budget, which they have brought it down to 0.5, which will help poor countries to pay their food and energy bills. The horrendous and shameful military spending, as some of the speakers already said, which is around $2.4 trillion, according to CIPRI, that need to be reduced. And we have to have some ceasefire or peace in areas like Ukraine and Sudan. My next point is that we should introduce, all countries should introduce universal basic income, which is a guaranteed income to all citizens, regardless of their employment status, income, or assets. And also we need to ending all wars and military spending, and instead build a campaign to establish ministries, departments for peace in all the countries to promote culture of peace and non-violence, conflict resolution, and eradication of poverty and inequality. The idea, which I have already explored in my 2019 book, Establishing Departments for Peace and Peace Centers Worldwide. I'm also part of a group called All-Party Parliamentary Group for Aid Match, started by my daughter Renu Mehta. which is advocating for more overseas aid to be given to developing countries through NGOs. Dear friends, reducing inequality will help create a more stable world. If people feel they have a stake in the society, they will be less determined to engage in violence, less likely to engage in violence or other forms of social unrest. Dear friends, key to economic development is in promoting infrastructure which can and give greater access to job opportunities, education, healthcare, and other social services. And the policies which promote equitable distribution of resources, such as job training programs, and in other words, creating level playing field. To achieve the above, we need a vibrant peace movement which can campaign for ministries and departments of peace, which we need urgently today. But how can we upscale the peace movement? Because we have at the moment, worldwide, we have a non-existent peace movement with decline of the ideas of the West, which is freedom, social equality, internationalism, progress, etc. My answer is by focusing and following those movements who called for abolition of slavery, right to vote for women, same-sex marriage, who were once branded mad people until history proved them right. In conclusion, let me say, eradication of poverty and inequality should be the key priorities of any government or any country, as people deserve to live a life of dignity, respect without poverty, inequality, and instability. Let me finish with two quotations. One is from Mahatma Gandhi, who said, "There is enough in the world for everybody's need, but not enough for everyone's greed." And the other one is from the Booker Prize winning Indian author, Arundhati Roy. And she says, "Wars will be stopped when soldiers refuse to fight, when workers refuse to load weapons onto ships and aircraft, when people boycott the economic outposts of empire and which are strung across the world." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vijay, very much. Your message has come through loud and clear. And one of those messages that and I thought the Gandhi quote you gave was really appropriate, that there is enough in the world for everybody's need, but not to satisfy everybody's greed. I noticed David Swanson, our next speaker, has made a few points in the chat, and David, would like to hear more from you. David is Executive Director, World Beyond War, Advisory Board Member, Nobel Peace Prize author, War is a Lie. So David, we look forward to hearing what you think of the discussion so far and what your concerns are.
Well, I have enjoyed the discussion thus far, and thank you very much for inviting me, and let me know if you can hear me clearly. To show my gratitude, I would like to give you all a quiz. There are going to be 9 questions in this quiz, and you can put your answers into the chat. at World Beyond War, we've recently published a collection of maps called Mapping Militarism. If you go and look at them, you can pick a map, zoom in, zoom out, click on a country to get the details, move the slider back to see earlier years. You can switch to a list view and get the information in text form. You can click on the source to see the origins of the data and what it means. But I'm going to show you just 9 screenshots of particular maps and ask you what they are. And I would note that we make these using software called Mapbox. We have no ability to get them to make the northern areas smaller and the central areas larger to better reflect a spherical reality. We have no ability, if everyone could mute, please, that would be great. We have no ability to get them to make the, to split off any occupied nations and call them independent. So please believe that we know the earth is round and that we oppose every single occupation. So let me share screen, and this is the first map. Let me know if you can see an image here, okay. What is it a map of? What are the red nations? You can put your answers in the chat. I wonder if I can see the chat while sharing the screen. I think I can. What are the red nations? Anybody, go ahead and put it in the chat. What world's largest military alliance are the red nations members and partners of? The answer, I think I'm obliged to give you, is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They are NATO members and partners. The position of the North Atlantic may make this a little bit tricky. I'll bet you didn't even know that New Zealand was in the North Atlantic. I'll bet you didn't even know the Warsaw Pact was still around to be battled with by NATO. I think some of the maps that we have yet to look at may help establish that NATO is basically a disguise for US militarism, through which it creates a pretense of legitimacy and legality while avoiding accountability. Needless to say, NATO has helped to create an enemy for itself in Russia and is intent on accomplishing the same with China. Needless to say, Russia has disgracefully taken the bait, and China may too, and we may not survive it. But we would be better off without NATO. And when the people of Montenegro try to protect their homes from being turned into a giant new NATO training ground, it simply isn't enough to scream Putin, much less to yell democracy. Let's go to number 2, if I can get it to do it. There it is. What is map number 2 showing? What are the red countries? Feel free to put a guess in the chat. This is something very, very central to the topic of war. If you have any guesses, you can put them in the chat. The red countries are countries with wars happening on the ground now. We are aware, of course, that drone wars exist and that proxy wars exist. One person was upset with this map because we showed war in Mexico and not in the US, though US gun deaths are higher than in Mexico. He might also have mentioned that most of the guns in Mexico come from the US, but this is a map of data from a particular source using a particular set of criteria, namely the Uppsala Conflict Data Program that maps nations with 1,000 or more deaths in the past year from conflict involving a military. We encourage thinking about and questioning this data and creating other maps, but take a minute to look at the places that are colored red. Until the past 2 years, the northern countries of Russia and Ukraine were not on this map. Look at the other countries in terms of wealth, in terms of climate, in terms of geopolitical alliances, and keep them in mind as we look at more maps. Number 3, third question, what does this map show? It is almost, but not exactly, a mirror image of the map of wars. Do you think it could be a map of peace? Yeah, I don't either. So what is it? What does the red country, and then less so the pink, orange, yellow countries, have to do with the whole business of war? These may be harder than I thought, as I've not seen a single guess to any of them in the chat. These are the countries that manufacture and export the weaponry of war. Apart from Ukraine and Russia, most places that have wars have not manufactured any of the weapons being used, and one nation dominates. Of 230 other countries, the United States exports more weaponry than 228 of them combined. The other two, the distant second and third place nations in dealing war weapons, are France and Russia. And business is booming. Number 4, what is this map? The most extreme is red, then pink, then orange, then yellow, then white. Blue means no data. You can ignore the blue. What is it? Anybody have a guess? Anybody want to place a bet that they know what this is? You might want to bet perhaps $2 trillion. This is a map of military spending measured in number of dollars spent by each country. Red is the most, and it's not even close. Out of 230 other countries, the United States spends more than 227 of them combined. Of the other 3, 1, India, is a US ally, and the other 2, Russia and China, spend a combined 43% what the US does, or a combined 21% what the US and its weapons customers and allies do. With just enormous respect for Kate, I think it is misleading to even use the phrase one of the highest spending countries. There is only one. This doesn't mean that whatever country you live in doesn't spend an obscene amount of money on preparations for organized murder, but it does mean that your country is much closer to Iceland's or Costa Rica's $0 than to the spending of the United States, and that a reduction by the United States could create a major reverse arms race, and that without the US government, war could quite easily be on the way out as a relic of a barbaric past. 5th question, similar to question number 4, but with a twist. How many people can get this one right? How many people? There may be a clue there. This is military spending per capita. Qatar is the huge leader. Israel is in a distant second, with the United States very, very close behind in 3rd, followed by Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Kuwait, and Norway. This is a useful measure to consider how much each person is paying or having paid in their name for organized killing and destroying. The weapons dealers don't want you to look at this map or the last one. They want you to measure military spending as a percentage of an economy and to think of it as a public good, so that the more money you have, the more you must chip in and spend on war, as if it were a philanthropic responsibility. We don't share that point of view, that worldview, that we don't think that disgusting nonsense, and we don't make that map. I will note that World Beyond War calculated and added the US per capita spending, while all the other spending numbers came from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And we do not know why SIPRI does not know how many people live in the United States. 6th question. If you have been getting any of them, this one might stump you. I think most people have been getting none of them. This one is very likely to stump you. If you have a guess, put it in the chat. What are the red countries doing or having done to them? They are all illegally punished with economic sanctions by the US government. We have added this map this year because sanctions are intentionally deadly, illegal, and often a step toward war. They also don't work on their own terms. They also damage much of the world, not just the places targeted. Somebody got it right in the chat. Number 7, this one might be easier. Red is the highest, then pink, then orange, then yellow. Blue is no data or irrelevant. What do you think it can be? It has to do with the number of certain people who are in each country. But what sort of people? Anybody get it? This is the number of US foreign troops present. The US is blue because we are only mapping troops deployed abroad. And a few other countries are blue because they are suffering under the thumb of evil enemies of freedom. Yes, that is satire. And yes, I admit that satire is more evil than war, and I confess my sins. But are you noticing how different the US is from the rest of the world in all of these maps? Since 1945, the US military has acted in a major or minor way in 74 other nations. At least 95% of foreign military bases on Earth are US bases. The presence of US bases tends to lead to war and not to prevent war. 8th question. As always, at Mapping Militarism, we have mapped efforts for peace as well as for war. The blue countries in map number 8 are doing something peaceful. What is it? It is huge. It is enormous, but it is little known. But you all might know it. The blue countries are in nuclear-free zones. Last chance. Here is a map of 193 blue countries in which at least one person has done a particular peaceful thing. What do you think it is? In each of the blue countries, at least one person, sometimes many thousands, has signed the Declaration of Peace at worldbeyondwar.org. How did you do? I can talk for hours if nobody else wants to.
Well, I noticed that quite a few people understood and had some of the answers. Do you agree? Were you encouraged?
I suspect that I went too fast and that a lot of people don't know how to use the chat, but there were definitely some answers in there. I think more than you would get from the general public. So I think these are people who know something about the material.
Yeah, there was somebody who spoke about the Mexican government still refusing to recognize we're in a war. It's incredible how a political party tries to cover what's clear from the outside. Then someone answered the question, the answer was military spending and sanctions. Someone's mentioned refugees. Does that strike a chord with you?
It's a good guess and an important topic, and maybe some sort of map we should include next year, but it wasn't a correct answer.
And of course, Caroline Langdon, to everyone, says it was a good quiz. We need to do it all over again. So you've got a lot of people whose interest has been whetted by your quiz. So now I'm afraid, David, we've gone past your allocated time, but because we're also intrigued and taken by all your quizzes and questions. And so maybe we can come back to that in the Q&A session. But now can I invite John Gittings, former Guardian journalist who specialized in China and East Asia, author of The Glorious Art of Peace. So John, you've had a chance to hear from several speakers now, and we look forward now to hearing from you. So
Thank you very much.
John.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear
me?
Hello,
John. Yes, we can hear you.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to pick up on what Vijay said, the question he put to us, which is also the top of the agenda too. How do we tackle global inequality, poverty, and instability? I'm going to talk about two things. One is existential risk, and the other is United Nations. And the two subjects are connected, as I'm sure you all realize. It's now widely accepted that the world faces a perfect storm of existential risk, that is, risks to the existence of humanity. And it is a triple storm. First, a deadly new pandemic, on the wane now, but a warning that it or others, which could be even worse, may come at any time. Second, the climate crisis, which is escalating even faster, today's news, than the worst predictions. And third, the constant threat posed by nuclear weapons, dramatized now by nuclear threats and uncertainties over Ukraine. And we're beginning to realize that the dangers of all of these have actually been long well known, but they've been downplayed or neglected until it is or it might be too late. And a fourth existential risk has now been added to the agenda, and that is artificial intelligence and the unintended consequences that AI may bring about. But I'm going to suggest here that there is a fifth existential risk as dangerous to the future of humanity as the others. And like the others, up until recently or now, it has not been properly understood as a risk to the existence of humanity. And I'm referring to the subject of our debate, world poverty and inequality. Of course, we haven't been unaware of its existence, and in various ways, the international community has tried to tackle it. But the extent of world poverty and inequality has often been minimized, or it's been dealt with by the comforting belief that things are improving for the majority of the world population and the trend is in the right direction. How often have we been told that global poverty is fast decreasing? And how often have we been given these statistics about the decline of what the World Bank calls extreme poverty? There has certainly been a reduction of extreme poverty, though much of it is accounted for by East Asia, mainly China and Indonesia, and South Asia, mainly India. But the World Bank has long had another more realistic measurement, which is less often referred to, moderate poverty. And in 2013, about 1.5 billion people were estimated to live in moderate poverty, plus the others living in extreme poverty. Altogether, this suggested that a decade ago, between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 of the world's total population was already living in poverty. A rather different picture from the one usually given. I haven't made a recent calculation, but war and climate change will undoubtedly have made these figures even worse. What has also not been properly understood is the knock-on effect. Just as there's a knock-on effect in climate change, our own climate is affected by glaciers melting far away from us, so our social and economic well-being is connected to the opposite of well-being in countries far away. This is beginning to hit home at last to the more developed, richer, and historically exploiting part of the world because of migration from the less developed, poorer, and historically exploited part of the world. This has a further knock-on effect. The tensions and discords created by this unequal world, and particularly by mass migration, the pressures for it, and fears of migration, are fertile ground for the rise of populist stroke authoritarian regimes. And these regimes are not just bad substitutes for democracy, but their leaders are less likely to take into account long-term threats to society and more likely to discount well-established facts, particularly those on climate change. So they make the world an even more dangerous place by ignoring the existential risk posed by global inequality and poverty. And that's my first point. My second is linked to this one, and it has to do with the United Nations. When we talk about the United Nations, we think mainly about its peacekeeping role, and it's often blamed for failures. The failure of the United Nations here, there, everywhere. Actually, of course, those failures are the result of member states not giving the United Nations the power that it needs, or ignoring the United Nations altogether, as the UN was ignored in the Iraq War. Is that a problem? Sorry. Sorry, did somebody say something?
I think someone has unmuted. We can hear.
Yeah, can you please mute yourself? Yeah, carry on, John.
Okay, right.
Yes.
So I was saying that when we...
Yeah, it's okay.
have,
now it's been muted.
Yes, I've muted, I think, where we think the disturbance came from.
Yeah.
Yes.
What I was saying, I'll just repeat myself, when we were talking about the United Nations, we think mainly about its peacekeeping role, and it's often blamed for failures which actually are the result of member states not giving the UN the power it needs, or ignoring the UN altogether, as the UN was ignored in the Iraq War until eventually it had to, in such cases, it may have to intervene to pick up the pieces. We've always talked much less about the huge importance of the UN's economic and social programs, which actually have a precedent, a very important one, also overlooked in the social and economic programs of the League of Nations. That is where the whole idea that an international organization should address and take care of economic inequality and social deprivation began with the League of Nations. There's an unfortunate paradox here that very little is heard about the activities of the WHO or UNICEF or UNHCR, many other agencies which go on month by month, year by year. They're not big news items at all. Actually, the charities which do fantastic work, like Oxfam, Save the Children, Médecins Sans Frontières, they get more publicity. And yet these agencies, the United Nations agencies, are expected to cope with anything that comes their way. And if there is a crisis or war or natural disaster, as at the moment in Sudan or in Bangladesh, and they fail to cope, very largely because they've been under-financed and under-resourced, then we hear the question asked again and again, where is the United Nations? At the root, the United Nations suffers from lack of commitment and lack of support. Lack of commitment by governments. For example, when the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres made his peace mission last year to Moscow and Kyiv, he had nil support from any Western government, including the British government, obviously, but the other European countries and more widely. I mean, he just came back saying, I can't do it. He came back more or less empty-handed, except, of course, the limited gain, important, of course it is, of the negotiating the grain shipments out of Odessa. But on the larger issue, he told his staff, sorry, as far as getting peace in Ukraine is concerned, I can't do it because I have no support. Governments also routinely fail to meet targets for special UN appeals in times of crisis. And of course, sometimes they fail to deliver in time or in full the regular funding to which they should be committed. But that's fine. So governments don't do enough to make the UN the organization which it was envisaged. One should go back to San Francisco and see, particularly on the part of these smaller nations, the non-veto nations, you might say, see the ideals and the hopes which were invested in the United Nations at that back at its inception, and which are reflected, of course, in the Charter, in the opening preamble to the Charter of the United Nations. But the UN also suffers from a critical lack of support from us, the citizens who take the UN for granted. There's never been as much support for the UN right from the start as there was between the wars for the League of Nations. Among radical and left campaigns, the picture is also mixed. Historically, the UN has often been regarded as irrelevant or dominated by powers who are hostile to radical goals. And UN has often been, during the Cold War, the UN was routinely criticized both by the Soviet Union and by the United States. But we can and we should be using the UN much more. And we do have one great achievement in recent years. That is the achievement of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, in bringing out about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which stands out as an example of what can be done. So in conclusion, and addressing the ambitious agenda set out by Vijay for this conference, I'm suggesting just two things for discussion. First, that we should treat global poverty and inequality as an existential risk on the same level as others. And second, that we should promote much greater visibility for the UN in this field, as well as in peacekeeping, and we should mobilize on the left and across the whole spectrum of public opinion, much more support for the UN. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, and thank you very much for just highlighting again the two main points in your conclusion, which is give priority to global poverty and inequality as to other issues, and we need to mobilize and show more support for the UN. And now our last speaker is David Adams, former UNESCO Director of the Unit for International Year for the Culture of Peace and coordinator of the Culture of Peace News Network. So David, we look forward to hearing what you have to say about the discussion so far. So welcome, David. Is David Adams?
Thank you.
Welcome. Hello, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been a very interesting program. And I agree with someone who said that, I think it was Federico Mayor who said that we're in a new era when we can speak from all over the world together, thanks to this kind of media, and thanks to the initiative of people like Vijay Mehta. Thank you, Vijay. Well, I'm pleased to follow John Gittings because I agree very much with what he was saying and will elaborate on some of his points. And of course, it goes back to Vijay's comments in the beginning about the problem of increasing inequality in the world. First, I want to give some good news, which is that what we see on the Culture of Peace News Network is that the global consciousness of people in the world that a culture of peace is both needed and is possible, this global consciousness continues to develop. And this is, of course, a very important basis for eventually changing from a culture of war to a culture of peace. Now, the bad news, of course, is that global inequality continues to rise, as Vijay and John have pointed out, and that they lead this rising inequality. Well, this has been going on, of course, for centuries, but it's getting worse and worse, and it leads to a crisis of democracy, because when people vote, they're voting out of their anger against the governments that are supporting exploitation and governments that are promoting increasing inequality. And so people vote against that just out of anger, and we get the Trump syndrome of people who support Trump are there because they're angry at the US government's support for Wall Street and Silicon Valley and not support for the people. And of course, it's not just Trump in the United States. I live in France, where there is a serious danger that people will vote for fascism in this country because the government is completely aligned with the banks and the big corporations. Well, all of this growing inequality comes from the culture of war. When I left UNESCO, I wrote a book, The History of the Culture of War. And one of the conclusions was that the reason the culture of war has been so successful and continues to be successful is that it is a culture of exploitation, which creates inequality, and those who run the culture of war profit from it. Well, how can we get to a culture of peace? I think that we had a glimpse of this when Federico Mayor was the Director General of UNESCO. We were able to develop peace initiatives to follow the blue helmets in El Salvador and Mozambique and other countries. And we were able to mobilize 75 million people in the Manifesto 2000 to commit themselves to working for a culture of peace in their communities. And we were able to pass probably the second most important resolution in the history of the United Nations after the Declaration of Human Rights, the Declaration and Program of Action on a Culture of Peace. Well, I would hope that UNESCO can return to giving a priority to the culture of peace. And I have the pleasure to say that today I spoke with several national commissions of UNESCO who contacted me because they're interested in this direction. But that's for the future. I hope we will move in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and everybody has been brilliant, all the speakers in sticking to time. So I think we will now have now we can go to questions. And looking at the chats, people have made excellent points. So we've got, please forgive me if I mispronounced your name. We've got Buju Eke Schneider. I think his name slipped. We have to bridge poverty, democracy crisis with the rising of social movements. So basically, hopefully we will get a few more questions. But I mean, I think all the points Vijay set out have been highlighted by each of the speakers. And that is really, I think the common theme is that priority is being given, especially in the West, led by the US, to spending on the military and less on what was needed to the causes of violence, and which is really inequality and poverty. And as Vijay said, if you spend more money on training, on education, on health, you would have less tension. And there'd be more, as you said, David, maybe that we would move towards a culture of peace. So now, any questions? First of all, I wonder if the speakers would like to address questions to each other. And then we'll also see if anybody else is asking questions. So David, since you came in last, are there any questions you'd like to put to any other speakers?
Well, yes, I think it would be good if the other speakers could address the possibility of returning to a priority of culture of peace in the United Nations. Protector Federico Mayor could respond to this.
Okay, Federico Mayor. So would Federico Mayor like to respond to this?
He is being muted.
Yes, now it's
Are you
correct.
okay now? Yes.
Very well. No, I was saying that David Adams did an immense job in order to promote a culture of peace. But once more, we must realize that the culture of peace was against directly the present plutocratic and supremacist governance of the G7, G8, and at this moment, we were always, I remember when I was in UNESCO, I never had the support of the G7. And when I left UNESCO, also immediately the culture of peace was not promoted as I thought that we should do. Therefore, I think that now that we can, because at this moment was very difficult. But now I repeat that for the first time in history, we recognize ourselves equally in dignity. This is very important because now we can say, yes, we the peoples of all the world. And all these peoples now must support the first phrase of the Charter of the United Nations that says we the peoples have resolved to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of the war. And at this moment, if we have really the possibility of having very popular claims at the worldwide level saying that now the moment is arrived, because now we can participate, we can have a multilateral system. But as I was telling at the beginning, what is happening? You remember that when Obama, President Obama, was brave enough to go to UNESCO, to United Nations and sign the resolution to transform the world of the Agenda 2030. And when he was in Paris signing the agreements for climate change, and 6 months later, a man arrives, Donald Trump, and says exactly the opposite. And what we did in Europe, we were silent. No reaction. Right. No reaction. Why? We had no reaction because we are under the power of the G6, G7, G8, G20. Now we must tell to the European Union that they cannot go on having this unanimity. Unanimity is the antithesis of democracy, and that the European Union now must really become an important group and force at the worldwide level.
Thank you very much. If I owe an apology to Thomas Daffan, and there's also Alicia Cabezudo. Both of them would like to ask a question. So many apologies, Thomas. Would you like to put your question now? But you need to be unmuted.
Sure.
Yes. So,
right. Hello. Yes. Thank you to everyone who spoke, and many friends, old friends on this chat I've met before. Yes, I think we also need to reflect on what we failed to do. I mean, we represent certain elements of the peace movement. Instead of just blaming NATO or America or whatever, let's look at what we haven't done either. Let's self-reflect. One thing we haven't done is reach out to the masses. We live in a system where either in a democratic state, I don't agree with my speaker, David, although I've, welcome, hello, David. The fascists are not going to get power in France. I'm sorry, I also live in France. We have to use democracy for peace. We have to somehow tailor our message to the masses, because at the moment they've been gamed with populism and nationalism, like Brexit. So my question really to everyone, and it's not like there's not a simple answer. Let's think about this. How do we get this peace message across, not to just a small group of aging, old peaceniks like us, but the young, my children, your children, our grandchildren, the masses that watch game shows or the Eurovision Song Contest? I'd like to live in a world where peace is as attractive as the Eurovision Song Contest, say. And, I've been trying to think this through with the World Intellectual Forum, which I'm chair of. And I'm very excited at the UN Summit of the Future, which I've been involved with. I think, there is new thinking possible. And it's not, we invented all these weapons. We've created the problems of the planet. We can outthink them. This is a big challenge for Homo sapiens. We're supposed to be. So anyway, thank you for all you've done. You're all living saints. But how can we get this message across to the millions? That's my question.
Well, you've all heard the question, and a lot of hands are raised. So first of all, Alicia, you have had your hand up. First of all, do you want to answer this particular question about how do we get the message to the masses, and then also say what you wanted to put to the panel? So Alicia, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for Vijay, the dear colleague in London that prepares this meeting, and also to old friends that I met here, as well as GAMIP members. One of the issues that I think it is very, very relevant, and we have failed exactly, at least in the field of peace education, as I am a cultural peace educator from very many years in Latin America, is that we think that peace is only one format. And then we have a kind of model that you have to create, following this model that, by the way, was more or less pointed by the United Nations, that it is not a good example of peace, indeed. So I think that one of the issues that we have to think is about working with the people, making and respecting their own ideas and creations about what is culture of peace, what kind of culture of peace they create in their territories, and how we can make them and kind of international wave with this. So my question to the speakers, that I congratulate them all, is how do you think we can manage in the educational field in order to organize this terrible world in peace patterns? We have tried, and we are very, very thankful to the program of Culture of Peace at UNESCO during the period of Dr. Federico Mayor Zaragoza and David Adams. But what do you see, how do you see we can create this?
Right. So can I put that to the other panelists? So how do we create, or I think education is one way, a culture of peace? Which of the panelists would like to address that? And then we've got hands from Tom Cuthbert and Gregorio Lopez. So I will go to you after panelists answer this particular question. How do we create this atmosphere, culture of peace? So who would like to speak? Or Tom, would you like to say something on this or ask your own question?
Well, I'll tell you what we're doing in dear old England, which we feel is very cut off from the rest of Europe, partly because of the tendencies of Brexit, but certainly not because of things like Eurovision, which was thought to be highly politicized because of sympathy for Ukraine. But what we're doing at a grassroots level is, after our local elections, we're approaching all our local councillors asking for a decision about the Prohibition Treaty. It's quite difficult because, unfortunately, every political party, bar one, the Greens, have a policy which is not supporting the Prohibition Treaty. So I was literally working on letters to our local councillors when I suddenly remembered about this Zoom conference. So it starts at grassroots level, and the people that have just been elected in my local area, for example, they told us, first of all, that this wasn't a local council issue. And so what we're determining to do is to persuade them that issues which have an international effect and international significance are of concern to people in local councils throughout Britain. And this process is just starting. Now, I don't know what happens with your elected councils and assemblies in other parts of Europe, for example, but it's very important to us to tell you what we're trying to do and make connections with you. And this very weekend, I'm going to RAF, so-called USAF Lakenheath, to protest along with European friends about the suspected and probably the location of US nuclear weapons at RAF Lakenheath, along with the jets that will threaten Russia, we guess. There is a terrible feeling of anxiety, and I come across it a lot when I go on the streets when we're leafleting. My particular area is around St Albans, and there are terrible feelings of anxiety about nuclear war. I even spoke to a local reporter the other day who kind of admired what we do in our particular campaign, which is Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, but simply said, people almost feel overwhelmed and lack the confidence to come out on the streets to campaign. It's often a question of confidence. And you can see why the government has put in legislation to persecute protests. They arrested people, for example, at the coronation, a very public thing to do, which they regretted. So there's this undercurrent of trying to stop protests, valid protests, which we're also trying to fight as well. Now, my question, I'm sorry to go on so long, but my question is, do you think there is any significance to the G7 today, and why aren't they discussing nuclear disarmament at the G7? It's probably a pretty obvious answer, but they should be. It's an iconic location in Hiroshima. Why aren't they discussing nuclear disarmament in Hiroshima today? Thank you.
Right, who would like to answer this? What do you think, David Swanson or John Gittings?
Well, they are discussing, this is David Swanson. They will be discussing opening a headquarters for NATO in Japan. And when you're doing that, and when every US newspaper is running editorials about the need to further militarize Japan and make Japan war mad for the good of the world, then the agenda of nuclear disarmament is the complete opposite of what's being furthered there. So there will be a lot of protests, and there will be a lot of speakers, including the survivors of the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and there will be demands for support for the treaty and for the Constitution that the United States imposed on Japan, and which you can find promoted only in Chinese media. So, you know, times change. Japan has a population that still understands peace to some extent, but it is a subservient proxy state. It is, as pretty much every other country on earth, the 51st state of the United States, and it's not going to oppose that agenda without a massive uprising of nonviolent resistance, and we haven't got that level of it.
Thank you. So John, do you think, since you've already spoken, I could invite Gregorio Lopez, who's been very patient, and then I'll come to you?
Fine.
So Gregorio, you've had your hand raised for a while. Is yours a question, comment? And if it's a question, to whom?
Muchísimas gracias. No sé si me escuchen.
Sí, te escuchamos.
Okay. Ok, perfecto. Su servidor, soy de México, país México, y acá a mi edad van a decir, ¿y todavía estudiando? Sí, todavía sigo estudiando. Estoy estudiando la maestría en Ciencias para la Paz. La termino ahorita en unos 3 meses. La termino acá en la Universidad Mexiquense del Bicentenario. Y para mí es un honor participar aquí con tan brillantes ponentes, tanto las damas como los caballeros, con una currícula impresionante. Mi pregunta...
Gregorio, espera, porque yo pregunté si querían que te tradujera y me contestaron que sí, lo que no sé si por escrito o en forma oral. Espera que pregunto. I translate in the chat better because it is quicker, or translate in the paragraphs. Let me know, please.
What would be easier for you?
Well, I think it's quicker in the chat, making a kind of summary.
Okay. The chat is, we've got lots of comments. So would you be able to summarize as we are now? Because, yes, because I've seen there are a lot of comments and it's difficult to distinguish which one is from you. So maybe just very briefly, you could summarize the points Gregorio made.
Okay, well, he said that he is Mexican And besides, he is a little bit older. He continues studying, and he is ending the master in peace studies in Mexico. And so he is very grateful to be in this meeting and to hear from the relevant statements done till now. Listo, Gregorio.
That was absolutely brilliant translation.
So he's very, very thankful. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So John, you've got your hand up. Thank you.
Yes, I was going to address the question which we came up a little bit further back, which is how can we get through to, on a mass basis, to particularly to younger people. And one of the reasons why I was suggesting that we should talk in terms of existential risks is that young people, there's one risk which the vast majority of them are well aware, which of course is climate change and the disasters coming down the way for them as they grow older. And I think we have to sort of wrap up in a package all these different threats in a way which can be comprehended, which is comprehensible, can be comprehended as so they're not disconnected. You see, I think if you talk to young people about one of these, let's say pandemics pass, nuclear weapons, yes, you galvanize interest, and then interest wanes again. I think we have to present a package of. I mean, it's in a way one doesn't want to sort of alarm or frighten, but one has to do it one has to find a positive way of presenting in a package the multifold risks which we all face across the board. That's my point.
All right, thank you very much. I've got a question. It's from Thomas Daffan again. Can someone explain what is the war going on in Mexico? We don't hear about it at all. And it was shown in David's map. So can anyone enlighten us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, excellent.
It's a complicated situation in Mexico, but one aspect of it is the drug cartels, which are financed by the CIA. And they are sending drugs across the border, and the American government is trying to put a border force on to stop these drugs coming on. What is fentanyl is one of the drugs in question here, and there's a sort of a civil war going on between these various groups, criminal groups. Some of the police are involved in this. It's a very, very messy situation. So that's my contribution to try to explain that for you. There might be more to it, but others of you might have more on this. But
yes. Anybody else have more to say? Otherwise, John, you've got your hand up. John Gittings, someone needs to be unmute him. Can someone unmute?
No, I've lowered my hand. I've lowered my hand. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Oh, I see. So you don't want to ask any at the moment. Right. So I'm trying to look at the chat to see someone has said we create an attractive culture of greed and narcissism with AI and algorithms. Peace that catches the people's attention would be in the streets. This looks like quite a good point. Any of the panelists, any participants give their views on what they think of this? Who would like to speak? David Adams, would you like to say something about this? AI, the role?
Well, not so much AI, but alternative media is very important. And we need to push very much more with alternative media. The more that we push the alternative media and people turn to it for information, the more the commercial media will need to change in order to recapture the audience they're losing to us. So this is a very important area where we need to be working.
Tom Cathcart and then Thomas Stafford again. So Tom, you've got your hand raised. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes. Well, I have a confession to make. I have 4 grandchildren, and one of them is a young chap of about 11, and it's quite alarming how many violent video games and extremely aggressive films are put over. And you look at the average content of movies throughout the 600 TV channels or so, they're extremely violent movies. And I think a protest about the violence in some of these movies needs to be made by peace organizations, because strangely enough, they tend to influence people. They give people a taste for a kind of world of action and demonstrable violence towards other people. And in most cases with children, it's just sort of play. But with some, perhaps, who might not have succeeded at school, or perhaps find their lives a bit boring or have dropped out the system, and that relates to drug cultures as well. It's a very unfortunate option in their lives. So can we not protest against the level of movies and things that appear in social media, which kind of encourage this kind of action life? Because it's seemingly very attractive to kids who might just be very, very bored with what happens to them, and they need to be taken away from this and encouraged through sport or through other activities that these things aren't acceptable. Now, my granddaughter, I'm very proud to say, is what they call in English schools a bullying ambassador. She's an anti-bullying ambassador, and it's very good to say. This, to me, is a kind of peace education, very personal within English schools, to disapprove of angry and violent behaviour. And maybe I'm wrong, but why is it just? It seems to be very often just boys and young men that are affected by this. Does anybody have an answer? Is there anybody who works in social service that can confirm that? But it does seem very often, when you hear about the incidents of stabbings in cities around the UK, to be an ailment that affects young men. That's really all I've got to say.
Well, who would like to answer that? Who's in a position or has experience that, you might be able to answer Tom's question about the young people, why they're drawn to violence? Anybody on the panel working on this? No. Okay.
It's a hard question, I grant it.
It is a hard question. Maybe people can work on it, or maybe people will be motivated to try and find an answer. Thomas, you got your hand raised for a while, or what was your question?
So I put my hand up because of this question of, we have a culture of greed and narcissism promoted by AI now, and the internet even, and film, and you brought in the question of violent films. So what's the antidote to this? I just want to put on the table the arts and culture. Yeah. I'm a poet and a philosopher, and there is a thing called the Delphic Games, which some of you may have heard of. It's a revival of an ancient classical games that ran for 1,000 years. The Delphic Games were where the intellectuals and artists, poets, dancers, theatre people of Greece used to go and perform. It took place 2 years after the Olympic Games. The Olympics were for sport, competitive throwing javelin stuff. The Delphic Games were for the life of the mind, and they were as important in the classical world as the Olympics. I'm the education officer for the Delphic Games. It's based we have members in many countries, and I'm trying to get the information about the Delphic Games out in schools and to young people, to professors around the world in every university. I would like the Delphic Games to become as important as the Olympic Games. Every 4 years, the world would come together and celebrate dance, poetry, theatre, music, fashion, film, and new arts. There's ecological arts is one of the 6 art forms we're working with. So find out about the Delphic Games, tell your kids, tell your schools and universities. And it's an idea that I think could capture the public imagination, just as the Olympic Games did 100 years ago. And we can get filmmakers involved, submitting their work. You know, everything from the Royal Ballet and Opera House down to the street rapper who does stuff on the streets of LA or whatever. So anyway, I'll put in the chat a link to it. Okay.
Well, that'd be really helpful. And maybe, I don't know if Vijay, if someone on your team could note these links and maybe circulate it later on, so that people can follow up. Erica, you've got your hand up. Can someone unmute Erica, please?
Okay, hello. Good afternoon or good morning. I'm Erica from Mexico. And well, the question is, as a specialist, what do you think it could be cover the Agenda 2030 talking about peace, the reality, because we have an expectative, right? So the reality and the expectative that could be done up to the Agenda 2030, because, for example, as you said before, in internet, there are a lot of influencers, but honestly, the conflicts and the violence are still on. One example is the conflict here in Haiti. Another one is the Afghanistan conflict, and another one is the Sudan conflicts, no, that are now up to date. And the whole world are just in cover. For example, I know it's important to Ukraine and Russia's problem, but I think that the conflicts are still on. So we are in 2023, so I think that up to 2030, it doesn't work. So as a specialist, what do you see? What do you think? I would like your opinion about that. Thank you.
Who would like to address Erica's question? So Erica, would you just like to repeat that question again?
Please, yeah.
Yes, that as a specialist, what would be your opinion about if the Agenda 2030 could be done by that day or not? I'm thinking about expectations versus reality. Because in my point of view, we are in 2023 and it's worthless. So what's your real opinion? Because as you said, as a student, they must have to know the reality, not just possible for solutions, no, the reality about this option of peace.
So, I collect, you want people to talk about the options for peace. You think this is inadequate?
Yes, because it's the Agenda 2030 from the UNESCO. So I want to know the real, if it's possible, because it's 2023, so up to 2030. So we have just 7 years so as to cover that. So as a specialist, I wanted to answer to me, what do you expect the reality?
May I have a word in that?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, so we've been discussing this in Germany quite a lot because, you know, in fact, I wanted to talk about something different to just give a bit of hope, but let's talk about this issue. So the point is that we know now, we know it, yeah, that we will not be able to commit to the goals and targets set for 2030. It's not possible. The temperature increase will be higher. We are emitting around 42 gigatons of carbon dioxide every year. What was calculated that we could still expel, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that we would have at the most 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide in the air before the 1.5 Celsius degree limit is broken, which implies that, you know, this implies that if we spend 42 gigatons per year and we have 400 gigatons left in order to not to increase the temperature of the atmosphere by more than 1.5 degrees, then we have less than 10 years left, which is the case. So maybe we have now 7 years, but I would say that even that is uncertain because climate change is not linear, but chaotic and exponential. And we have situations that, for example, are worsening quickly. All the Mediterranean area is heating up 2 degrees Celsius more than the average increase of temperature around the Mediterranean area. And we don't know what the effects are. We also know that we cannot stop climate change as such. What we can change, the only thing we can change is our attitudes. So it's human behavior. And this implies that as 10% of humankind is using 90% of the energy of planet Earth, this 10%, not the 90% of people, but this 10% of people are the ones who could, let's say, improve the situation by simply drastically stopping their consumption. Because if 90% of the people on planet Earth can live the way they live, there is, in my understanding, little reason to state that the other 10% cannot do the same. I guess they can do the same. And this implies that these 10% would not consume 90% of the energy of planet Earth. But, you know, that 10% of the 100%, which we estimate is the lower consumption, yeah, of the 90%, which implies that it's all down to the change of attitudes. And I don't see that social policies, and Burcu Eke Schneider is, for example, pointing at them. She is saying that we need transformation. And transformation is a complex issue. It's a complex program that needs to be understood in terms of culture, transformation in social terms, in economics. So it's in terms of industrial policies, it's in terms, obviously, of peace. And for that, we need to increase cooperation. And in order to increase cooperation, we have to drop drastically the numbers of interpersonal violence. It's not just war. Sexual abuse is raving around the globe. And sexual abuse and rape are by far the most, let's say, deeply disturbing, psychically speaking, causes of trauma, and also the most popular. There is huge numbers of rape and sexual abuse on planet Earth, and this disrupts cooperation. So we have to address what I call, this is what I publish about, the entire system of violence. And we have to address it all at once, in one go. We cannot address it partially. So we cannot fight terrorism because the system of violence is there in a proportion. There are mathematical paradigms below the system of violence, and we must know them. So we must fight violence at once, all of it, and increase cooperation. And I think that what Burcu says is very valuable in this sense, that we need a culture of transformation. And we can say that we did an experiment here in Germany for the last 3 months. And in this experiment, we managed to set up 2 exhibitions for peace. We are now about 40 artists and social sciences, scientists, and peace mediators. We are working steadily. we got the support of some politicians, we got the support of some industrial people, we got the support of the press. Normally, we expected to be attacked as Putinists. We were not attacked as Putinists. We were respected. So far, we've done well. And what we've created is a huge amount of work in terms of communicating with people in the street. We have created a lot of events to which the general public attended. And we had, for example, school classes coming in. We did cinema projects, we did filming, we did, you know, a huge amount. We have a large program, it's online, anybody can watch it and see it. And this all worked. And I think that this kind of personal initiative in the street is what can bring change. This is at least the experience we do in Germany. We hope it encourages other people to try other things else, you know, in other places. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very, very positive note. I think at this stage we've got just under 3 minutes left for this discussion. So I think we better press on with winding it up. And maybe at this stage, we've heard how we need to give more support to the UN and how America and the West are leading the way in increasing expenses on the military rather than giving priority to improving the life of people on the ground and the poor, and that could reduce tension. So now could I ask each of the speakers very briefly, just to say one very point on the way forward. So what do we do next? So is Federico Mayor Zaragoza here? Would you like to have one last message for everybody who's attended this meeting on the way forward?
Federico has left.
Oh, he's left. So Kate Hudson has left. So Vijay, I'll come to you for the wrapping up. So David Swanson. So
Peter, I'd like to say something, please. I've had my hand up for some time. I'd like to.
All right. Okay. Let's.
1 minute. Give me 1 minute.
Yeah, so, yeah, I'm trying to find you here on this panel.
Been waiting for a long time here.
Can someone unmute you, please? Frank, yeah.
Right, now I'm going to be 1 minute because Frank wants to get in here as well, all right?
Sure,
I want to hear Frank, but let me just say one thing here, all right? About this Agenda 230, all right? Yeah. Now, I could speak about this for an hour. I'm going to say in 1 minute, all right?
Yes.
You must go to the WEF, the World Economic Forum, and you will find out exactly the program of deindustrialization and depopulation that they have planned, all right, for this Agenda 230. That's all I'm going to say. Go and research it, find out, and, you know, I'll leave it there. Frank.
Okay, I'm afraid according to Vijay's schedule, it's now 19:55 and we've got 5 minutes to wrap up. So
no, can you give Frank, Rita? Can you give Frank?
Okay,
Frank.
Okay, Frank, please. Yes, please say something.
Oh, yes, I would like to say quite a lot, but I will just make one specific point. First of all, about myself, I can date my first activity that can be described as working towards peace very specifically to September 1949, when I moved a resolution at my trade union branch opposing the rearmament, which was already starting at that time. In all the, how many years that is from then, I have been involved in a very small way. I don't make any great claims, but I've been involved in a very small way at pretty well every campaign that can be broadly described as part of the peace movement. And what my conclusion is, sadly, is that I have failed because we have not made the sort of progress towards peace that I would have wanted in 1949. The peace movement has failed, and it's really, while all the things that we've been talking about here, the many very good points that have been made about all sorts of things, the fact remains that we activists are still a very tiny minority. And while we think that this conference is excellent, how many people are actually involved are absolutely minuscule. In the first, one of the things I was involved in was the first special session of the United Nations on Disarmament in 1978, and the subsequent 1982, when a petition with over 32 million people signed the petition asking that the final document of the first session should be actually acted upon. And we think, oh, wonderful, millions and millions. But what we actually need is billions, not millions. And unfortunately, the vast majority of the people, as has been pointed out, we somehow don't get through to them. Possibly inevitable in that they are, the vast majority of people have all their time put out just to make a living for themselves. And one very last thing, I'd like John Gittings to say something about the role of the General Assembly as opposed to the Security Council, and particularly thinking of the way the TPNW was created by activity of the General Assembly.
Thank you. John, did you want to say something
quickly? In 10 seconds, I would say, yes, Frank is absolutely right. The General Assembly, from the start in 1945, was always trying to do more. I don't have time to go into what it does manage to do. Read the speeches, which they never get reported. We really should focus on the General Assembly, not on the Security Council. You're not going to get rid of the veto because only they can do that. They're not going to. We have to work in the General Assembly, as was done for TPNW. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I think there's a lot more good points in the chat, but unfortunately no time. So Vijay, can I hand over to you just to say again that you've created such a magnificent space for us to discuss these issues. And as several speakers have pointed out, now we need to get this message out to the masses. And I think probably social media and the other ways we might be able to do it. But anyway, now for your final comments, Vijay.
Thank you, Rita. Yeah. First of all, let me thank all the distinguished speakers, Frederico, Kate Hudson, David Swanson, John Gittings, and David Adams for their thought-provoking and engaging presentation. I think the same goes for all the participants who made the evening a very vibrant one and a successful. A note to the speakers, please send us by email your speeches, as we are going to make a report in our next Uniting for Peace newsletter. So thank you, Chair, as well, for ably chairing today's session and controlling everyone and keeping them in their place. And a brief word to the audience. Okay, David, we will give you 1 minute before we go. Just hold on. A word to the audience. I appreciate your tireless efforts to build peace in the world. And if you are passionate about it, reflect on the evening, what we have been saying and doing. And if you are inspired, better still, become member of Uniting for Peace, as we are looking at with the financial squeeze, we are looking for donations. Go to our website and you can say. So now let me say that today, private citizens have more power to do public good than ever before because of the power of internet and campaigning NGOs as a global movement in developed and developing countries. Our strength is in building citizen power by which we can shape our destinies and the future of the world. All of us, remember, have the power to change the world because everyone is a power in itself. One voice can make an impact. One brick helps build a home. One candle lights the room, and one smile conquers the world. So the power of one leads towards unity, and all of us have the power to change the world. So let me thank you, all of you, this evening, activists, thinkers, change makers. You have been a great audience. Thank you very much for being here today, and we will invite you again to our next event and hope to see you soon. Let me finish with two quotations. One is from Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And the other one, which probably some of you have heard from me before, is by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And that's how the quotation goes. If you think you are too small to change the world, try sleeping with a mosquito. So thank you very much, all of you. And Rita, back to you if you want to say the last word. Oh, David Adams wanted to say something. David?
Welcome, David. You can have the last word.
Vijay, I wanted to use the same quotation from Margaret Mead, that it is a small group that can change the world. Of course, we should try to get our message out to the masses, and I agree with that too. But I would like to see this kind of video event on a global scale every single month. And for all of us to take part and to invite more people to take part in it also. So Vijay, can I ask you to send a mail to everyone who is here asking who can host the next meeting, and or maybe have several meetings in advance so this process can continue. Thank you.
How about yourself? David, how can we start with yourself organizing the next meeting?
Let me think about it, because I'm not sure I have the capacity to do it, but let me think about it.
Okay.
But ask everyone, okay?
I will. Okay, thank you very much for being here today. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah,
thank you.
Love you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye all. Bye. Bye, BJ.
Thank you.
Bye. See you soon. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. I'm glad to be able to connect all the way from Uganda. Good to see you all, and thank you for the great ideas.
Welcome.
Brilliant. Thank you
Excellent.
very much.
Thank you. Great to hear from you. Excellent.
Okay.
Bye-bye from Argentina.
Bye-bye.
I am Marta Lescano.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye from St.
Argentina.
Merci bien de la France.